Mr. Netanyahu did not get what he wanted, which was a war with Iran. So that's a good thing. That doesn't end the probability of future war with Iran for Israel and us, but at least it's a breathing space. The bad news is he continues to enjoy unconditional support for this program of mass expulsion and murder in Gaza. And as we see within the last 24 hours, 26 people were killed in bombings last night, most of whom I'm told are children. So this nonsense continues, and no one is willing to stand up and stop it. It's a condition of moral bankruptcy in London and in Washington that is clearly without precedent, I would say.
I respect all of that and agree with almost all of it too. But I think we have to consider the shift in paradigm, Colonel. We've, until now, worried about the fact that Israel wanted a war with Iran. We may be entering an era in which Iran might want a war with Israel. If there is an all-out massacre in Rafah, for example, I now no longer believe that Iran will sit back and watch that, but will in fact use that as a launch pad for hegemony across the Muslim world.
Well, there's certainly evidence to support your assertion. I don't think that Iran is delusional in the sense that it thinks it could be the dominant force in the Islamic world because it sits next to Turkey, and the Turks are certainly not going to tolerate that. I think what we're really seeing in addition to Iran is the broader Muslim world coalesce. What hasn't happened yet is that some of the governments that have been dragging their feet, like the Kingdom of Jordan, the government in Egypt, they're not the only ones. I'm not sure they will last much longer because their populations will demand action. And when they don't get it, they'll remove the government. I think Mr. Erdogan has changed his behavior recently because he lost badly in Turkish elections, at least in part for his failure to engage decisively against the Israelis. So I think we're going to see more of the Muslim world engaged than we've seen in centuries. So that much Mr. Netanyahu has achieved. The question is, what do we do? And we seem to be inept and powerless to exert any influence, largely because of what we've been discussing. The people that were cheering and waving the Ukrainian flags are bought men, or they're simply fools. I think that's a pretty good...
Because they've already got themselves nuclear weapons, you know. Every intelligence agency with any degree of credibility that's looked at it has made it very clear that Iran is at most a threshold state. In other words, if they decided to build nuclear warheads, they could do it pretty rapidly. But thus far, we don't have any evidence that they have. I think you should also consider that Pakistan has promised nuclear warheads to Mr. Erdogan in the event that he thinks he needs them. And it would be very easy to get those to Turkey and for the Turks to mount them on missiles. So I think Israel is in a very difficult position, and what worries me is that instead of coming to terms with reality, that this mass murder and expulsion policy is the death knell of Israel, and instead stopping it and seeking a way out of this terrible mess that they created, that they themselves will decide to use a nuclear weapon. Mr. Erdogan has said so publicly, and others in the region have also said they know what the Israelis have, and the Israelis have made it very clear on numerous occasions that they are willing to use it. That would be disastrous at that point, I think. There is a very high probability that they will attack Hezbollah, which is convincing everyone in the region to turn against him. The Saudis, like the other ruling elites in the Arab world right now, are very concerned about being removed by their own people because the populations are enraged. This is certainly true in Jordan. I think King Abdullah is hanging on by his fingernails. He's got millions of Palestinians in his country that are appalled at what's being done to their fellow Palestinians on the other side of the Jordan River. You've got General Sisi, who is apoplectic. We have been driving him, willing to forgive his $180 billion national sovereign debt in return for taking in the Palestinian Arabs that are being driven out of Gaza. He's incapable of doing it. He understands that if he does that, he's going to be seen as a traitor to his own people, and that's a pretty good description of the way many Egyptians feel about him at this point. Everything is coming apart in the region. And as you point out, he's blaming it on everything and everybody but himself. Used phosphorus to destroy an entire village of people in Lebanon. I wonder if we paid for it. I wonder if we supplied it. Well, we do have white phosphorus in our inventory. Normally, we use it to mark a target as opposed to burn down a village, but it can be used for that purpose. White phosphorus is terrible. I mean, I've seen people with holes in their arms where a very small droplet of white phosphorus fell on a soldier's arm and you could literally see right through the arm. The thing was, the arm was melted in many respects. I mean, it's a horrible weapon, so I can understand why people would be horrified by that. But at this point, if you're an Israeli, you take the position you are the permanent victim. Tactical nuclear weapons, which is my great fear because that would literally open Pandora's box and put the very existence of Israel at very, very high risk. Is there or are there any staging troops or weapons? Well, I was alerted by a source that's very familiar with Cyprus. Actually, a British source was saying that the Israelis were preparing to utilize facilities on Cyprus, specifically airstrips. I don't know whether or not that happened because very early on in Zala, the leader of Hezbollah warned that if that were the case, they would regard Cyprus as a legitimate target for their weapon systems. But again, as we discussed much earlier, this is a very dangerous thing to even discuss because it involves the Turks. The Turks are very sensitive right now because they know that the Israelis and agents from the United States are working to stir up the Kurds against the Turks. Turks are looking southward and they see the danger of Kurdish violence directed at them. In other words, an actual war front opening up to the south and to the east. And at the same time, now they're looking at Cyprus as a potential springboard for the Israelis, and they're not going to allow that to happen. The Turks are very sensitive to Cyprus. It's the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean. They don't want that to fall into the hands of Israel for fear that it might be used against them, and there's so much anger in Turkey right now. Knew that if he was going to win the conflict against Hamas, that he would probably expand the war certainly to Hezbollah in the hopes that that would bring us into the conflict on his side. And of course, that means bringing Iran into the war as well. In other words, he's intent on blowing up the region on the assumption that with us, he can destroy all of Israel's potential or real adversaries and then dominate the region in perpetuity. I think it's a very dumb idea and it's a very dangerous idea. The first thing he should be concerned about preeminently, above all things, is the survival of the Israeli state. That should be our concern at this point. Where does World War III start? In Israel, Gaza, or in Russia, Ukraine? You know, I have trouble believing that it would start in Ukraine. I really do, because I think if we look at these latest election results from the European Union, it's pretty damn clear that the European people are unhappy with their governments and they don't want a war with Russia. Now, they may not all think that what's happened in Ukraine is justified. They may not like what's being done, but they know they don't want a war with Russia. So, I would argue that the great danger right now is in southern Lebanon, that if the Israelis, who have failed miserably to deal with Hamas effectively, now turn on Hezbollah, that will widen the war, that will inevitably bring in Iran. He's talking about a 7-front war. That's much more than what he's even discussing. That means that the Iranians will launch their arsenal at Israel. You know, then the question is, what does everybody else in the region do? Will Sisi go away? Will King Abdullah be replaced? And will these Arab states suddenly erupt like volcanoes and spew out hatred, hostility, violence against Israel on a scale that no one today can even imagine? This is my concern. And then finally, the Turks. The Israelis have been very smug and arrogant about the rest of the region, saying, oh, that's impossible. They'll never do this. They'll never do that. And yet the evidence has always been there that these populations and governments and scientific industrial capacities are greater than the Israelis thought, and that there's a greater willingness to fight against them than they anticipated. And that's my concern. Everyone is miscalculated, and here we sit waiting for the volcano to erupt.